Oberstleutnant Friedrich Weber had not slept in 36 hours. He stood alone on the jagged limestone cliffs north of Calais, the wind tearing at his gray Wehrmacht coat like the fingers of vengeful ghosts. The English Channel stretched before him, a vast expanse of steel-colored water that had separated empires for 1,000 years. In his trembling hands, he gripped the Zeiss telescope, the finest optical instrument the Reich could produce. But what he saw through its lenses made him wish he had never looked at all. The horizon was moving. At first, Weber thought exhaustion had finally broken his mind. He blinked hard, rubbed his salt-stung eyes, and looked again. But the image remained unchanged. Impossibly real. Where sea and sky should have met in an empty gray line, there was instead a dark mass that seemed to pulse and breathe, a living wall of steel and iron that stretched from one edge of his vision to the other. 7,000 ships. The number would be confirmed later by intelligence officers in their desperate reports, but Weber didn't need confirmation. He could count them himself. Hundreds upon hundreds of vessels, and beyond those hundreds, hundreds more. Liberty ships, LSTs, destroyers cutting white scars through the water. Battleships whose guns could reduce concrete bunkers to powder. And above them all, the sky itself seemed to darken with aircraft, thousands of them, like a plague of mechanical locusts blotting out the dawn. "Mein Gott," he whispered, and the words were stolen by the wind before they could fully form. Weber had been a soldier for 23 years. He had marched through Poland with the panzers, watched Paris fall in glorious summer sunlight, survived 2 winters on the Russian front, where the cold turned men into brittle statues of ice. He had seen things that would haunt him until his last breath. Mass graves, burning cities, the frozen bodies of his own men stacked like cordwood outside Stalingrad. But he had never seen anything like this. This wasn't an army. This was the wrath of nations made manifest, the accumulated fury of an entire continent that had suffered under the Reich's boot and now rose up with biblical vengeance. Every ship represented factories working around the clock, millions of workers, resources from across the globe flowing toward this single moment. The Americans, the British, the Canadians, they had built an armada that would have made the Spanish conquistadors weep with envy. And it was headed south. Not here. Not to Calais, where every German officer had been certain the invasion would come. The intelligence reports, the logic, the captured Allied documents, all of it pointed to Calais as the obvious choice. It was the shortest distance across the Channel, the most direct route to Germany itself. All of it had been wrong. Weber's hands shook as he adjusted the telescope, following the direction of the fleet. They were passing him by, heading southwest, along the coast, toward Normandy, toward beaches that were defended, yes, but not like Calais. Not with the massive concentration of forces that had been positioned here, waiting for an invasion that would never come. He should report this. He should run back to headquarters, shake General von Salmuth awake, scream into the telephone until someone at OKW listened. He should do something, anything, to sound the alarm before it was too late. But Weber couldn't move. He stood frozen on the cliff's edge, telescope pressed to his eye, watching the greatest military operation in human history unfold before him like a terrible dream. His mind raced through the implications with the cold efficiency of a general staff officer. The Atlantic Wall. 2 years of construction, millions of tons of concrete, mines sown like seeds along every beach, obstacles designed to tear apart landing craft. All of it positioned to defend the most obvious invasion route. And the Allies had known this. They had counted on it. They had fed German intelligence exactly what it wanted to hear, had positioned entire phantom armies in England opposite Calais, complete with dummy tanks and radio chatter. The deception had been perfect. And now the Reich would pay for its certainty with blood. Weber thought of the young men dug into bunkers along the Normandy coast, boys, really, some of them not yet 18. Ostliegenden troops from the Eastern Front, exhausted veterans who had been promised a quiet posting by the sea. They would be eating breakfast now, perhaps, or writing letters home. In an hour, they would be fighting for their lives against an enemy that outnumbered them 10-1. And they would die. Most of them would die. Behind him, in the bunker complex carved into the cliff face, he could hear the morning watch changing, the casual banter of soldiers who thought they were safe, that the real danger would come here, where they stood ready. Should he tell them? Should he watch their faces collapse as they realized their positions, their guns, their minds? All of it was as useful as sandcastles built above the tide line. A seagull cried out, sharp and mocking. Circling overhead, Weber lowered the telescope and looked down at his hands. They were shaking badly now, palms slick with cold sweat despite the morning chill. On his right ring finger, he wore a simple gold band. Anna had given it to him in 1927, in a small church in Bavaria, when the world still made sense. She was in München now, with their daughter. Safe, he had told himself. As safe as anyone could be in the dying Reich. But he had known, hadn't he? Deep down, in the parts of his mind he didn't examine too closely, he had known this moment was coming. Every soldier knew. When you conquered half a continent through blood and terror, eventually that debt came due. Eventually, the world turned its guns toward you and pulled the trigger. Weber raised the telescope one final time, taking in the impossible scope of the Armada. The early morning sun was breaking through the clouds now, illuminating the fleet in harsh detail. He could see tiny figures moving on the decks of the closest ships, American boys probably from Kansas or Ohio, checking their rifles and trying not to vomit from seasickness. They were terrified, he was certain. Most of them had never seen combat. But they were coming anyway, thousands of them, tens of thousands, and behind them, millions more waited in England, in America, in camps and factories across the world. Men and machines in quantities that Germany could never match. Not anymore. Not after Russia had broken the back of the Wehrmacht. Not after years of strategic bombing had reduced German production to a fraction of Allied output. The mathematics of war were ruthlessly simple, and the equation now pointed to only one conclusion. Es ist vorbei, Weber said quietly to the empty air. It is over. Not today. The war would grind on for months, yet perhaps another year. More cities would burn. More soldiers would die. More atrocities would be committed in the Reich's death throes. But standing on this cliff, watching 7,000 ships sail past his position toward their destiny, Friedrich Weber understood with crystalline clarity that the outcome was no longer in doubt. The question wasn't whether Germany would lose. The question was how much more blood would be spilled before the inevitable end. He thought again of Anna and his daughter. He thought of the orders that would come soon, orders to hold, to fight, to never surrender. Orders from men in Berlin who would never stand on this cliff and see what he was seeing. Men who would demand that soldiers die for a cause that was already lost, just to buy a few more days or weeks of denial. Weber had always followed orders. It was what soldiers did. But as he turned away from the channel, the telescope heavy in his hands, he wondered not for the first time, but perhaps with more urgency than ever before, what happened to men who followed orders into the abyss. Behind him, the greatest armada in history continued its inexorable journey south. The tide had turned, not in the channel, but in the war itself. And Friedrich Weber walked slowly back toward the bunker to make his report, carrying with him the certain knowledge that everything he had fought for, everything he had believed in, was about to be swept away like footprints in the sand. The invasion could not be stopped. The bunker command room smelled of stale coffee, cigarette smoke, and the acrid odor of men who had been underground too long. Weber burst through the steel door, his boots echoing on concrete as junior officers looked up from their maps and reports with surprised expressions. "Get me OKW, now." His voice cut through the morning routine like a knife. Lieutenant Hartmann, barely 22 years old with a face still soft with youth, blinked in confusion. "Sir?" The Army Group Headquarters, or the High Command, Supreme Command West. I don't care who you get, but get someone who can reach von Rundstedt or Rommel. Do it now. The urgency in Weber's voice galvanized the room into action. Hartman grabbed the telephone receiver, cranking the field phone with trembling hands. The other officers gathered around, sensing something catastrophic in their commander's demeanor. Weber had always been calm, methodical, the kind of officer who inspired confidence through his unshakable composure. But now his face was ashen, his eyes wild with something that looked dangerously close to panic. "What did you see, Herr Oberstleutnant?" asked Major Krebs, the intelligence officer, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm, as if expecting enemy paratroopers to crash through the ceiling. Weber didn't answer immediately. He moved to the wall map of the channel, his finger tracing a line southwest from their position. "They're not coming here. The invasion is happening now, but not at Calais. Normandy, the entire Allied fleet, is passing our position, heading southwest." Silence fell over the room like a physical weight. Someone dropped a pencil, and the small sound seemed impossibly loud in the sudden quiet. That's impossible, sir," Krebs said carefully, as if speaking to a man who had lost his mind. "Every intelligence assessment confirms Calais as the primary target. The 15th Army is positioned here, specifically because—" "I don't care what the intelligence assessments say." Weber's fist slammed down on the map table, making everyone jump. "I saw them with my own eyes. Thousands of ships, Major. Thousands. Battleships, transport vessels, landing craft, the entire Allied armada sailing past us like we don't even exist." Hartman's voice cracked as he spoke into the telephone. "Yes, this is Oberstleutnant Weber's command post, North Sector Calais. We have an urgent report for Supreme Command West." "Yes, I understand it's early." "No, this cannot wait. I need to speak with someone. At the highest." The young lieutenant's face went pale as the voice on the other end grew sharp. He covered the mouthpiece and looked at Weber. "Sir, they're saying that Field Marshal Rommel is not at headquarters. He's in Germany, at his wife's birthday celebration." The room seemed to tilt. Weber felt the world sliding away beneath his feet. Rommel, the one general who might have acted decisively, who might have ignored protocol and moved the Panzer Reserves without waiting for Hitler's personal authorization, was at a birthday party. And Hitler himself, according to the intelligence reports, was asleep at the Berghof and had left strict orders not to be disturbed. The entire command structure of the German forces in France was fragmented, scattered, unprepared. By design, Hitler trusted no one with independent authority. Every major decision required his personal approval. And on this morning, the morning when that decision mattered most, he was asleep while his empire began to crumble. "Connect me to whoever is there," Weber said, his voice now hollow with despair. "Anyone who will listen." The conversation that followed would haunt Weber for the rest of his life. He spoke to a staff officer at Supreme Command West, a man he'd never met, a voice on a crackling telephone line, and tried to convey the urgency of what he had seen. But the voice on the other end was skeptical, drowsy, irritated at being bothered with what he clearly believed was a panicked overreaction. "Oberstleutnant, we have radar stations all along the coast. If there were thousands of ships, they would have detected them." "The weather," Weber almost shouted into the phone. "The weather has been terrible for days. Low clouds, rough seas. That's why they came. Now they knew our reconnaissance flights would be grounded. They knew." "We have standing orders regarding the disposition of reserves," the voice interrupted, maddeningly calm. "Those orders come from the Führer himself. No major movement of forces without his direct authorization. You understand this, surely. Then wake him up. For God's sake, wake him up before I will pass your report up the chain of command. If it's deemed necessary to disturb the Führer's rest, that decision will be made by someone far above both our ranks. In the meantime, maintain your position and await further orders." The line went dead. Weber stood holding the silent receiver, staring at it as if it might come back to life and tell him something different. Around him, his officers watched with expressions ranging from fear to confusion to a terrible dawning understanding. "They didn't believe you," Krebs said quietly. "They believed me," Weber replied, his voice distant. "They just don't care. Or they can't act. Or they're too afraid to make a decision without permission from a man who's asleep." He hung up the receiver with exaggerated care, as if it were made of glass. "It's all the same in the end." Hartman cleared his throat nervously. "What should we do, sir? What should they do?" Weber looked around at these men who trusted him to have answers, to know the right course of action. Young men and old veterans alike, waiting for orders that made sense, for a plan that would save them. But there was no plan. The great Wehrmacht war machine, which had conquered most of Europe through speed and decisive action, was now paralyzed by its own command structure. The tanks sat immobile, waiting for orders that might come too late. The reserves couldn't move without authorization. And somewhere in Normandy, men were dying because bureaucracy moved slower than bullets. "We hold our position," Weber said finally. "We wait for orders, and we pray that someone, somewhere, makes the right decision before it's too late." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were hollow. He had seen the armada. He had counted the ships, watched the aircraft darken the sky. The Allies hadn't come to make a tentative probe of the Atlantic Wall. They had come to break through it with overwhelming force, and they had chosen the one moment when the German command structure was most vulnerable. Someone at Allied headquarters had understood the German system better than the Germans themselves. They had known about Hitler's paranoid control, about the dispersed command structure, about Rommel's planned absence. They had picked this day, this hour, with surgical precision. And now young men were paying for that knowledge with their lives. Weber walked to the observation slit in the concrete wall and looked out at the channel. From here, he couldn't see the armada anymore. They were too far southwest now, approaching the Normandy beaches. But he could imagine it. The landing craft hitting the surf, ramps dropping, soldiers running through chest-deep water while machine gun fire tore into them. The chaos, the screaming, the blood turning the sea foam pink. It was happening now, right now, while he stood uselessly in this bunker, while staff officers debated and passed reports up chains of command, while Hitler slept peacefully in his mountain retreat. "Sir?" Hartman's voice was small, frightened. "The men are asking questions. What should we tell them?" Weber turned from the window to face his officers. They looked so young, even the older ones. Young and scared and still believing that their commanders knew what they were doing, that there was a plan, that the Reich they had sworn to serve was invincible. How did you tell them the truth? How did you explain that everything they believed was a carefully constructed lie that was now collapsing like a house of cards? "Tell them," Weber said slowly, "that the invasion has begun. Tell them to maintain readiness. Tell them." He paused, searching for words that weren't a complete lie. "Tell them that we're soldiers, and soldiers do their duty regardless of circumstances." It was the best he could offer. Hollow words for a hollow moment. As his officers filed out to brief their men, Weber sat down heavily at the map table. The red and blue markings showed German positions, Allied estimates, defensive strongpoints. All of it was meaningless now. The game had changed, and they were still playing by the old rules. He pulled out a photograph from his jacket pocket. Anna and their daughter Elizabeth, taken last Christmas in München. They were smiling, ignorant of what was coming, ignorant that the father and husband they loved was standing at the edge of an abyss, watching everything fall apart. "Forgive me," he whispered to the photograph. "Forgive me for what's coming." Because he knew now, with absolute certainty, that this war would reach them eventually. The invasion couldn't be stopped. The Allies would break through, establish a foothold, and begin the long, bloody push toward Germany itself. And when they came, they would remember. They would remember the camps, the executions, the conquered cities, They would remember everything the Reich had done, and they would demand payment in full. The telephone rang again. Weber stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. Oberstleutnant Weber. This is General Marx. LXXXIV Corps. The voice was sharp. Urgent. I'm in Normandy. We're under massive attack. American and British forces landing along multiple beaches. We need immediate reinforcement, immediate authorization to commit reserves. Can you confirm that Supreme Command has been notified? Weber closed his eyes. Yes, General. They've been notified. And they're awaiting authorization from the Führer. He cannot be disturbed. A long, terrible silence. Then, God help us all. The line went dead. Weber sat in the empty command room, holding a dead telephone, listening to the distant sound of artillery beginning to rumble like thunder from the southwest. The invasion had begun. History was being made. And he was powerless to do anything but watch. Somewhere in the Berghof, Hitler slept. Somewhere in Germany, Rommel ate birthday cake with his wife. Somewhere in Normandy, the largest amphibious invasion in human history was crushing the Atlantic wall like paper. And in a bunker near Calais, Friedrich Weber understood that this was how empires died, not with dramatic last stands and heroic speeches, but with telephone calls that went nowhere, with orders that came too late, with old men sleeping while young men drowned in blood and surf. The tide had turned, and nothing would ever be the same. 8 hours had passed since Weber first spotted the Armada, and the world had transformed into something unrecognizable. The bunker shook with each distant explosion. The artillery barrage from Normandy was now constant, a low rumble that never ceased, like the growl of an angry god. Reports flooded in through every communication channel, fragmentary, desperate, contradictory. The 352nd Infantry Division was being decimated at Omaha Beach. British forces had taken Sword Beach and were pushing inland. Paratroopers had dropped behind the lines throughout the night, cutting communications and spreading chaos. And still, the Panzer Reserves sat motionless, waiting for authorization that had finally come at noon, 6 precious hours after the invasion began. 6 hours that might have made the difference between throwing the Allies back into the sea and watching them establish an unshakable foothold. Weber stood over the radio operator, listening to a transmission from the 21st Panzer Division as they finally moved toward the invasion beaches. The voice on the other end was young, breathless with adrenaline and terror. Never seen anything like it. The sky is black with their aircraft. We lost 3 tanks before we even reached the assembly point. They're hunting us from the air like transmission breaking up can't move in daylight. It's suicide. We need air cover. Where is the Luftwaffe? Where? Static consumed the rest. The operator looked up at Weber with hollow eyes. That's the 4th unit reporting the same thing, sir. Allied air superiority is absolute. They're destroying our forces before they can even engage. Where is the Luftwaffe? The question that every German soldier in France was asking. The answer was simple and devastating. The Luftwaffe barely existed anymore. Years of attrition over Germany, over Russia, over the Mediterranean had ground it down to a shadow of its former strength. The Allies owned the skies now, and from those skies they rained down death with impunity. Major Krebs burst into the command room, his uniform disheveled, a map clutched in his shaking hands. Sir, I've been compiling reports from all sectors. You need to see this. He spread the map on the table. Red marks indicated German positions. Blue arrows showed Allied advances. There were far too many blue arrows, and they were pointing inland with disturbing depth. They've achieved breakthrough at multiple points, Krebs said, his voice professionally detached but his hands betraying him with their tremor. Utah Beach was taken with relatively light resistance. The defenders there were mostly Ostlegionen troops who surrendered quickly. Gold and Juno beaches are secured. Omaha was costly for them, but they're through. Only at Sword Beach have we managed to launch any kind of counterattack. And even there, he didn't need to finish. Even there, it wasn't enough. Weber studied the map with the eye of a professional soldier. The positions, the movements, the logistics, all of it told a story that was becoming increasingly clear. The Allies hadn't just planned an invasion. They had planned for every contingency, prepared for every obstacle. They had come with such overwhelming force that German resistance, no matter how brave or determined, was simply being crushed beneath the weight of it. Casualties? Weber asked quietly. Krebs swallowed hard. Difficult to confirm. Communications are spotty, but preliminary estimates from Normandy suggest thousands dead, thousands more captured. Entire units simply gone. Thousands dead. Weber thought of the young soldiers he had seen in Normandy just 2 months ago during an inspection tour. Boys from Bavaria and Prussia, from small villages and farming towns. They had asked him eager questions about combat, about medals, about when the war would end. He had lied to them, told them that Germany was strong, that victory was certain. Now, they were dead or dying on beaches whose names would echo through history. Omaha, Utah, Juneau, Gold, Sword. There's something else, Krebs said, his voice dropping lower. I've been monitoring Allied radio transmissions. Their codes are complex, but we can pick up some traffic. Sir, they're not just landing troops. They're landing entire ports. Prefabricated harbor facilities, something called mulberry harbors. They're planning to supply millions of men directly over the beaches. They're not taking our ports. They're bringing their own. The magnitude of it staggered Weber. The Allies had planned for the fact that Germany would defend or destroy every port along the coast, so they had simply built their own portable harbors and brought them across the channel. The level of planning, the resources required, the sheer audacity of it, it spoke to an industrial and organizational capacity that Germany couldn't hope to match. How do you fight an enemy like that? Hartmann asked from across the room, giving voice to the question in everyone's mind. You don't, Weber thought. You can't. Not when they can conjure entire harbors out of the sea, when they can darken the sky with thousands of aircraft, when every ship you sink is replaced by 10 more. The telephone rang again. Weber grabbed it, his patience for military bureaucracy long since exhausted. Weber, this is Colonel Hoffman, 15th Army Headquarters. The voice was clipped, formal, the sound of a man reading from prepared text. You are to maintain your current defensive positions. Intelligence assessment indicates that the Normandy operation may be a feint. The main invasion force is still expected to land at Calais within 48 hours. Weber felt something snap inside him. A feint? Colonel, with respect, I watched 7,000 ships sail past this position this morning. The Allies have committed their entire invasion force. There is no second landing coming. Normandy is the invasion. Your assessment has been noted, Oberstleutnant. However, Strategic Command believes. Strategic Command is wrong. They've been wrong about everything. Rommel was right. We needed to stop them at the beaches in the first hours. Now they're established. They're building up forces faster than we can respond, and we're sitting here defending a beach that will never be attacked while Normandy bleeds out. A dangerous silence on the other end. When Hoffman spoke again, his voice was ice. You are very close to insubordination, Oberstleutnant. I suggest you remember your oath and your duty. Maintain your position. That is an order. The line went dead. Weber slammed the receiver down so hard it cracked the casing. Around him, his officers stood frozen, shocked at their commander's outburst. In the Wehrmacht, you didn't question orders. You didn't criticize Strategic Command. You certainly didn't shout at superior officers over the telephone. But Weber had seen too much, known too much. The careful discipline that had defined his military career was crumbling under the weight of a truth too terrible to ignore. They're going to leave us here, he said to the silent room. They're going to keep the 15th Army at Calais, defending against an invasion that will never come, while the real invasion succeeds in Normandy, because they can't admit they were wrong. Because Hitler can't admit he was deceived. Sir, Krebs said carefully, perhaps you should rest. You've been awake for... I'm not mad, Major. Weber's laugh was bitter. I wish I were. Madness would be easier than this. He gestured at the map, at the red marks indicating German positions, at the vast concentration of forces sitting uselessly around Calais. We have an entire army here, enough strength to make a difference, and we're going to sit here doing nothing while Normandy falls, because no one at the top has the courage to admit they were outmaneuvered. He walked to the observation window again, looking out at the channel. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the greatest battle of the war was raging. Men were dying while he stood in safety, following orders that made no tactical sense. My father was a soldier, Weber said quietly, not really talking to anyone. He fought in the Great War, at Verdun. He told me once that the worst thing about being a soldier wasn't the danger or the fear. It was knowing that your death might be meaningless, that you might die because some general miles behind the lines made a mistake, or refused to admit he was wrong, or was more concerned with politics than strategy. He turned to face his officers. I understood what he meant today. Really understood it. Hartmann approached carefully, as if approaching a wounded animal. What are we going to do, sir? What were they going to do? Weber looked at these men who had followed him, trusted him, believed in him. What could he tell them that wasn't a lie? We're going to follow orders, he said finally. Because that's what soldiers do. We're going to man our positions, maintain our readiness, and wait for an invasion that will never come. And when this war is over, if any of us survive, we'll have to live with the knowledge that we could have made a difference. But we were in the wrong place at the wrong time, following the wrong orders. The bunker shook with another distant explosion. The thunder from Normandy continued. Relentless. The sound of an empire breaking apart. Get the men fed, Weber ordered, his voice returning to its normal professional tone. Rotate the watches. Make sure everyone gets at least 4 hours of sleep in the next 24 hours. If we're going to sit here uselessly, we might as well be well rested. As his officers moved to carry out the orders, Weber pulled out his writing kit. If he was going to be trapped here, unable to affect the course of events, he could at least leave a record, a testimony to what he had seen, what he had known. He began to write. June 6th, 1944. Today I watched the fate of Germany sail past my position. I reported what I saw. No one acted. Thousands of our soldiers are dying in Normandy while we guard an empty beach. If anyone reads this after the war, if there is an after for any of us, know that some of us saw the truth. We simply lacked the courage or authority to act on it. The invasion cannot be stopped. I understood that this morning. But watching it unfold, listening to the reports of our men being slaughtered while we sit idle, that is a torture I did not anticipate. I wonder if this is how Rome fell, not with a dramatic siege, but with 1,000 small failures, 1,000 moments where the right action was not taken, the right decision not made. Death by bureaucracy. Death by rigid hierarchy. Death by men, too afraid to deviate from doctrine, even when doctrine leads to disaster. He paused, pen hovering over paper. What else was there to say? That he was sorry? That he wished things had been different? That he had known, deep down, that this day would come ever since that terrible winter in Russia when he had watched the Wehrmacht's myth of invincibility die in the snow? The radio crackled to life again. Another desperate transmission from Normandy. Another unit calling for support that would never arrive. Another group of soldiers learning that they had been abandoned by the very system they had sworn to serve. Weber put down his pen and closed his eyes. Somewhere in the darkness behind his eyelids, he could still see those 7,000 ships, that impossible armada, covering the horizon, like a judgment from heaven. The invasion could not be stopped. He had known it in the first moment he looked through the telescope. But knowing and accepting were different things. Knowing and living with the consequences, that was the hardest part of all. The thunder from Normandy rolled on, endless as the tide. And in his bunker near Calais, Friedrich Weber waited for orders that would make a difference, knowing they would never come. Weber had not slept. He sat in the command bunker as dawn approached, surrounded by reports that painted a picture of catastrophe in crisp military language. The Allies had secured all 5 beaches. They were consolidating their positions, pushing inland, linking up their separate beachheads into a unified front. In 24 hours, they had accomplished what German planners had insisted would be impossible. The map on the wall told the story more eloquently than any report. The blue arrows had multiplied, spreading like cracks in glass. Each one represented thousands of Allied soldiers now on French soil. Each one represented German positions overrun, defensive lines broken, strong points that had cost millions to build, now reduced to rubble. And still, the bulk of the 15th Army sat at Calais, guarding against phantoms. Hartmann entered carrying fresh intelligence reports and a cup of ersatz coffee that smelled like burnt wood. "Sir, you should drink something." Weber took the cup but didn't drink. His hands were steady now, not from recovered composure, but from a kind of emotional exhaustion that went beyond mere physical tiredness. He had passed through fear and anger and despair, and emerged into a strange calm on the other side. "What do the reports say?" he asked. The 12th SS Panzer Division finally engaged the Canadians at Juno Beach. Hartmann's voice was carefully neutral. Initial reports suggested a successful counterattack, but the Allied naval guns intervened. Battleships firing from offshore. The division took heavy casualties and was forced to withdraw. Battleships, floating fortresses with guns that could reduce tanks to scrap metal from miles away. Yet another advantage the Allies possessed that German planners had underestimated. You couldn't fight ships with tanks. You couldn't advance under naval bombardment. The entire tactical doctrine of mobile warfare, which had served Germany so well in the early years, was useless against an enemy who controlled both sea and sky. "How many divisions have the Allies landed?" Weber asked. Hartmann consulted his notes. Latest intelligence estimates suggest 6 full divisions, with more arriving every hour. They're bringing men and material ashore faster than we can count them. The portable harbors are already operational. Sir, they're unloading tanks directly onto the beaches. Hundreds of them. Weber finally sipped the coffee. It was bitter, but the warmth was welcome. And our forces? Fragmented. The 21st Panzer made some progress, but was stopped by naval gunfire and air attacks. The 352nd Infantry has lost more than half its combat strength. The 716th Infantry Division has effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Most units are either destroyed, surrounded, or retreating inland to avoid being cut off. Ceased to exist. Such a clinical way to describe the obliteration of thousands of men. Weber thought of the 716th. He had inspected them 6 months ago. They had been a static infantry division, filled with older men and recovered wounded. Good soldiers, but not equipped or trained for the kind of mobile defense needed against a massive invasion. They had never stood a chance. "There's something else," Hartmann said, his voice dropping. "I've been hearing rumors from other units. Some of the Ostlegionen troops, the Russians and Poles we conscripted, they're surrendering en masse. In some cases, they're turning on their German officers." This didn't surprise Weber. Germany had filled out its coastal divisions with conscripts from the occupied Eastern territories, men who had been given a choice between serving in the Wehrmacht or starving in POW camps. Their loyalty had always been questionable at best. Now, faced with annihilation, they were making the rational choice. "Can you blame them?" Weber asked quietly. Hartmann looked shocked. "Sir, can you blame them, Lieutenant? For choosing survival over dying for a country that enslaved them, for recognizing a lost cause when they see one." "But we're German soldiers, sir. Loyalty to the Reich is easier when the Reich is winning." Weber set down his coffee cup. I'm not criticizing them. I'm observing reality. Those men were never fighting for Germany. They were fighting because we forced them to. Now that we can't force them anymore, they're making their own choices. The younger officer looked troubled, as if Weber had spoken heresy. Perhaps he had. But Weber found he didn't care anymore. He had spent a day watching the careful illusions of German superiority shatter like glass. One more illusion wouldn't make a difference. The telephone rang. Weber picked it up without enthusiasm. Weber, Oberstleutnant. This is General Blaskowitz, Army Group G. The voice was aged, weary. I'm told you were the first to spot the invasion fleet. Yes, sir. Then you were also the first to understand what it meant. A heavy sigh traveled down the telephone line. I've just come from a conference with Field Marshal von Rundstedt. The situation in Normandy is critical. The Führer has finally authorized the release of additional reserves, but they won't arrive in meaningful numbers for days. By then, the Allies will be too well established to dislodge. Weber said nothing. What was there to say? Von Rundstedt asked me to pass along a message, Blaskowitz continued. He said, and I quote, "The war is lost. Make peace, you fools." Of course, he didn't say it officially. It was just between old soldiers. The candor was shocking. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, one of the most senior officers in the Wehrmacht, essentially admitting defeat. Not publicly. Not in any way that would appear in official records. Just a quiet acknowledgement of reality between men who had served long enough to recognize the truth. What should we do, sir? Weber asked. Do. Blaskowitz laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. We do what we've always done, Oberstleutnant. We follow orders. We fight. We try to preserve as many of our men as we can, while fulfilling our duty to the Reich, even when that duty has become meaningless. Even when we know, he trailed off. Even when we know we're sending them to their deaths for nothing, Weber finished. Yes, precisely that. Another pause. I have a son in Normandy, 352nd Division. I haven't heard from his unit in 12 hours. Weber closed his eyes. I'm sorry, sir. We're all sorry, Oberstleutnant. Sorry changes nothing. The Allies are here. They're staying. And in a few months, 6, maybe 9, they'll be in Germany itself. Everything we've fought for. Everything we've sacrificed. It's all been for nothing. The line went dead, leaving Weber holding a silent receiver in a silent room. Hartmann cleared his throat. Sir, the men are asking questions. About Normandy. About why we're not moving to reinforce. About, he hesitated, about whether we're going to lose the war. Weber looked at the young officer, saw his own fear and doubt reflected back. These boys had grown up under the Reich, had known nothing but Nazi propaganda and tales of German invincibility. For them, this defeat was incomprehensible, a crack in the foundation of everything they believed. Tell them the truth, Weber said. Sir? Tell them that yes, we're likely going to lose this war. Tell them that the Allies have established a foothold in France that we cannot dislodge. Tell them that our best chance was in the first hours, and that chance is gone. Tell them. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Tell them that we're still soldiers, and we'll do our duty. But don't lie to them about our chances. They deserve to know what they're facing. Hartmann looked stricken. The men need hope, sir. The men need truth. Hope built on lies is no hope at all. It's just another way to die. As Hartmann left to brief the troops, Weber walked one more time to the observation window. The sun was rising over the channel, painting the water gold and red beautiful colors for such an ugly morning. He thought about the 7,000 ships he had seen 24 hours ago. They were at the Normandy beaches now, still unloading men and machines. By tonight, there would be more ships. By next week, there would be even more. The Allies had turned the English Channel into a highway, and they were using it to pour an unstoppable flood of military might onto European soil. Germany couldn't match it, couldn't stop it, could only delay the inevitable at a cost measured in thousands of lives per day. Weber pulled out the photograph of Anna and Elizabeth one more time. They were still smiling, frozen in that moment of Christmas peace. How much longer would they have? How long before the war reached München? Before Allied bombers turned his home into rubble? Before his family paid the price for the Reich's ambitions? He should write to them. Tell them, what? That he loved them? They knew that. That he was sorry? For what? For serving his country? For following orders? For being part of a system that had brought horror to millions and would now bring that horror home to Germany itself? There were no words adequate for what he felt. No way to express the complex tangle of duty and regret, loyalty and betrayal, courage and cowardice that defined these final days of the Reich he had served. Major Krebs entered, his face grave. "Sir, I've just received word. The 15th Army is to remain in position. High Command still believes Calais is the primary target. Normandy is officially classified as a diversionary operation." Weber almost laughed. Almost. Of course it is. Anything else would require someone to admit they were wrong. There's more. I've been monitoring Allied broadcasts. The BBC is reporting the invasion as the beginning of the liberation of Europe. They're calling it D-Day, the start of the final campaign against Germany. Krebs paused. They're probably right, aren't they? Yes, Weber said simply. They're probably right. He turned back to the map, to the red marks indicating German positions and the blue arrows showing Allied advances. In a few weeks, this map would be obsolete. In a few months, they would need a new one that showed Allied forces deep into France. In a year, there might not be a Wehrmacht left to need maps at all. Order all units to maximum readiness, Weber said, falling back into the familiar comfort of military routine. If the Allies do come to Calais, which they won't, we'll be ready. And if they don't, he shrugged, then we'll sit here and watch the war pass us by. As the day wore on, more reports filtered in. The pattern was consistent. Allied success, German failure, every counterattack thrown back, every defensive position eventually overrun. The weight of numbers, the superiority in air power, the endless naval bombardment, it all added up to an equation with only one solution. By evening, Weber stood once more at the cliff's edge where this had all begun. The channel was quieter now, but he knew that beyond the horizon, the invasion beaches were ablaze with activity. More ships arriving, more troops landing, the inexorable buildup that would eventually sweep across France and into Germany itself. He thought about the future, about what would come after. The Allies would advance. The Wehrmacht would resist. Because that's what armies did. More men would die tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands. Cities would burn. Families would be destroyed. And in the end, Germany would lose anyway, because the outcome had been decided the moment those 7,000 ships appeared on the horizon. Was it worth it? He asked the empty air. Any of it? The wind gave no answer. Weber pulled out his journal one last time and wrote his final entry. June 7th, 1944. The invasion is now irreversible. Our counterattacks have failed. The Allies grow stronger by the hour. I was the first to see them coming, but I was powerless to change anything. I think often now about responsibility, about the oath I swore, about the orders I followed. I was a good soldier. I did my duty. But was duty enough? When you serve a system that brings suffering to millions, does following orders absolve you, or does it make you complicit? I don't know the answer. Perhaps there is no answer. Perhaps that's the real tragedy, that good men can serve evil causes while believing they're doing right. If Germany survives this war, if any of us survive, we will have to answer these questions, not to our enemies, but to ourselves, to our children, to history. I saw 7,000 ships, and I knew in that moment that everything we had built would fall. not because our soldiers weren't brave enough or our weapons weren't good enough, but because we had made ourselves into something that the world could not tolerate, and the world, when finally roused, had the power to destroy us. That is the lesson of this day. Not that we were defeated by superior numbers or better strategy, though both are true, but that we defeated ourselves the moment we chose the path of conquest and cruelty. The invasion was inevitable, not because the Allies planned it well, but because we had made it necessary. May God have mercy on us all, though I'm not sure we deserve it. He closed the journal and looked one last time at the channel. Somewhere out there, young men, German and Allied alike, were dying for decisions made by old men in distant capitals. That, at least, never changed. War consumed the young while the old watched and made speeches about honor and duty. Weber thought of his own son, killed 2 years ago in Russia. 23 years old, frozen to death in a trench outside Moscow. Had it been worth it? Had any of this been worth it? No. The answer was no. It had never been worth it. But the war would continue anyway, grinding forward with its own terrible momentum until enough blood had been spilled to satisfy whatever dark gods demanded payment for human folly. Friedrich Weber turned away from the sea and walked back to his bunker. He would do his duty. He would follow his orders. He would remain at Calais, guarding against an invasion that would never come, while history unfolded without him. And when it was all over, if he survived to see that day, he would have to live with the knowledge of what he had seen and what he had failed to prevent. The horizon had been covered with ships. The invasion could not be stopped. Everything else was just the slow, terrible unfolding of consequences that had been set in motion long before that gray morning when he had looked through his telescope and seen the fate of Germany sailing past.